In this section, I want to talk about using a preferences fragment to change the first and last names of our hero in the ICNDB app. Before I do that, I want to clean up a couple of very minor pieces that I didn't show in the existing app. In the existing app, you will notice that the async task reference is listed as an attribute here. So while I generally start up a joke task and execute it, I still am assigning it to an attribute. Why am I assigning it to an attribute? Because in the onStop method, I'm saying if the task is not null, cancel it. Now what's going on here? Here's the issue. When I execute my async task to get the joke, I'm grabbing a new string and then I want to update the text view. In the unlikely but possible circumstance that someone rotates the phone before the joke comes back. So they click the button, they rotate the phone really fast, and then finally the joke comes back, it's going to go look for that text view to update. Well, remember, during an aspect change like that, the activity is destroyed and recreated. So the text view it was planning to update isn't there anymore, and that could be a problem. Now, in this particular application, it's not much of a problem. This is a joke server. I click on it again. Not a big deal. Also, as you can see, on any reasonable network, it's kind of hard to do anything that takes long enough to rotate the phone. I've never been able to simulate it myself. It's a very rapid application here. But it's still conceivably possible. So what I've done is I said, look, if you rotate the phone, then not only you're going to go through onStop, you're even going to go through onDestroy. I'm figuring, look, if you're going to go through onStop and the task is still running at this point, just cancel it. And the argument true there says if it's still running, cancel it regardless. They actually have documentation here to say attempts to cancel the execution of the task. Let's see if I can make that a little bigger. This attempt will fail, but it's already completed, already been canceled, or could not be canceled for another reason. The parameter says true if the thread executing this task should be interrupted. Otherwise, in-progress tasks are allowed to complete. Well, I wanted it to be interrupted if somebody rotates the phone, so I put in the cancel method there. That's one. The other thing that's in here is you may recall from earlier we talked about onSaveInstantState. The idea here is that if I got a joke back and then I rotate the phone, I'm going to lose that joke. Because again, I destroy the activity and recreate it, and I updated the joke display programmatically. Otherwise, it would go back to its original form. So here I'm saying if we rotate the phone on SaveInstantState, put a string in the bundle called display, go grab the joke views text and put it in there. And then up here in the onCreate method, if SaveInstantState is not null, then grab the display string out and update it there. So those are just in there to make sure I don't lose the joke once I've already gotten one. So at any rate, those are the remaining pieces of this application that I had, that you may have noticed as I scrolled by, but I hadn't defined yet. So the final piece of the puzzle here is how do I change the hero? And this will finally give us a chance to say something about fragments. So let me close all of the open files and talk about that. Now, again, in the main activity, in the onOptionsItemSelected method, one of the menu items is called Preferences. If I have selected Preferences, then I'm going to go from one activity to another activity. In this case, there's a special activity called a Settings activity. Let me bring up Settings activity. Just before I go there, you notice you create an intent from here to there, and you call Start activity with that as the argument. There's no extra to pass in this particular case. So I'll go to the Settings activity, and the Settings activity is extremely simple. Notice that for the first time, it doesn't actually load a content. It doesn't have an XML file associated with the layout. Instead, in this Settings activity, I'm going to do this. I'm going to get something known as the Fragment Manager, and I'm going to begin a transaction. Fragments are portions of web pages rather than portions of activities. Same idea, obviously, same as a frame idea, but it's a portion of an activity. And while an activity represents a complete screen, a fragment is a segment of that screen. And what you can do is you can have an individual section reserved for a fragment, and then you can either add a fragment to that section or replace an existing one. In either case, it has to be done in what's known as a fragment transaction. The begin transaction method would return as its return type a fragment transaction. In this case, I'm simply chaining the replace method onto it for this particular location and plugging in what's called a preferences fragment. Now, Android.R again. So I'm back to the R class in the Android package, the built-in one. Android.R.id.content is the layout inside of this activity or inside of any activity. It's the default layout. So I'm saying go ahead and find that and replace it with this class I'm going to call a preferences fragment and then commit the transaction. Nothing happens until you call commit. This is why there was no point in loading a layout. I'm immediately going to replace it with a preference fragment. Now, what we'll see, or what we can see, is that in an XML layout, you could add a fragment tag directly, but in this case, I'm going to go ahead and replace it myself. I also put in the set display home is up enabled, and since my IDE is complaining a bit about it, let me put in an if get action bar is not null, and I'll move that inside like so, and now I'll just get it to stop complaining. But this is the part I'm interested in. So let's take a look at the preferences fragment. The preferences fragment could not be any simpler. And that's the last time I'm going to use that phrase with anything associated with fragments. There is a class in the API called preference fragment. It is in the Android.preference package, preference fragment. All it provides me is a method called add preferences from resource, and you put your preferences in an XML file, r.xml.preferences. So now if I go look under source main resource, res folder, I have already added a folder called XML, and inside there is my preferences XML file. And you will notice it has a root element of preference screen, and I have two preferences that are text types. There are many types of preferences you could have. You could have checkboxes, you could have radio buttons, you could have all sorts of interesting things. Here I have two edit text preferences. The key is first, the title that shows up on the window will be first name, and the default value will be Tim. And here the key is last, and the title will be last name, and the default value will be O'Reilly. So if I want to use Tim O'Reilly, that is all set up here. So this is the set of preferences I have already provided. The preference fragment reads this, and when it displays it on the screen in my settings, it already has built in those edit text preferences, the ability for me to make modifications to the values, and then best of all, it'll save those values to the XML file without me having to do anything. When we talked earlier in the course about a shared preferences, we had to call get default shared preferences and go ahead and call edit and then call put of various data types and then call commit. None of that is necessary here. Now this, of course, is all involved in setting the preferences. The main activity is what's using them. And you can see here, when I actually try to tell a joke, then I use the preference manager's get default shared preferences method to return the shared preferences. And when I execute the joke task this way, I say prefs.getString first and last, and that pulls the values out of the preferences object. So let me go to the emulator, and the app is already running. And if I go under the ... here and select settings, there are my two edit text preferences in the settings activity. If I click on first name, there's Tim, and I could change it. I'll just say OK at this point. And last name, and say O'Reilly, and say OK at this point. And now when I go back, when I run this again, now it says Tim O'Reilly. Never has to build his program to machine code. Machines have learned to interpret Tim O'Reilly code. That's pretty good. Or Tim O'Reilly can make a class that is both abstract and final. That's some trick. I think it would be a somewhat better joke to say a method that's both abstract and final, but still a good one. Again, I can go back to the settings here, and I could change the first name to Xavier, and then I know I'm going to mangle this, but let me try anyway. Ducroet. Again, I'm sure I'm not pronouncing it right. Xavier Ducroet is the head of the Gradle Android plugin project, as well as the head of the Android Studio project. And now if I go back again and click on Get Joke, then I have changed the hero's name to Xavier Ducroet. And believe me, you will never find a fragment simpler than that. All I had to do was subclass the preferences fragment. Again, here it is. This way. Subclass the preferences fragment and say, add my preferences from that XML resource. And in my settings activity, which I'm creating, just go ahead and swap in that fragment, and the rest takes care of itself. It's remarkably easy to do. So hopefully that will be of use to you right away.